Hello there. Happy Sunday. It's another Sunday night stories with Spooky Ms. T.I. So here I am back again. I'm back in my same spot here. If you can hear the fountain next to me, I have a little Buddha fountain that's burbling away to my right, and the fish in their fresh water, newly cleaned tank to my left. So there's a lot of burbling and bubbling going on around me. So here we are. First of all, cheers. Here's to another night of spooky. Welcome aboard. So happy Valentine's Day. It's Valentine's Day here when I'm recording this. And for those of you, I've been looking like online and seeing people posting pictures of themselves with their loved ones, and some of us have been able to spend it with our loved ones, and some of us have loved ones that are far away. Some of us have loved ones who are on the other side of the veil. Some of us don't have loved ones right now, so we'll love you from this place. Yesterday I told some stories for Wheatland's Wheat Scouts, and I told stories about Valentine's Day, about love. And I talked about how love isn't always kissing and hugging and flowers and chocolate and that sort of thing. Love is action, and sometimes we find love with our neighbors, our friends, strangers even. When we show kindness and we show our hearts to people, that's how we spread more love around. And we may not have a present lover at this point, but we ourselves can be that present lover to everyone we meet or to whom we speak or run into. Just share it out. I set myself a goal long ago when I was leading a group that was standing up to a local neo-Nazi hate group, and the mission I gave myself was, whenever interacting with these hate-filled people, I would focus and give them 30 seconds of unconditional love, which was not easy when they were talking about skinheads who had behaved violently toward people I care about. But what I was able to do is imagine them as little boys, and how I would have seen them had they been sitting in a little table in front of me as a kindergartner or a first grader. And then I was able to pour that unconditional love out. And after that, then the conditions come in, because it's not loving to tolerate bad behavior or to tolerate hate. What's the loving choice in that point is to stand up to that. But I'm getting off track. It keeps cutting out, so it's going to probably be choppy later. But I wanted to talk to you tonight. Oh, first, cheers. Cheers to Spooky Sunday. I'm here with RBG. Can you see my RBG glass? Thank you, Katie Shana Maynard. So I'm having a glass of wine tonight. Cheers. Michelle, if you're there, I hope your power's gone back on. I saw you posted earlier that you found it ironic that I suggested you turn off the lights and light a candle, because you guys got some snowstorms down there where it's usually not snowstormy, and your power was out. So I hope your power gets restored and you're warm, and if not, you're cozy, you buy firelight and buy a candle. And I hope everybody who's lost their power in these crazy storms that we've been having lately, that you're safe and warm. So I suppose I should talk to you about, I should explain my real theme tonight. My theme is, I suppose, my purpose is to talk about how love is really the only thing other than our legacies that survive death, and how love manifests when we lose someone, or when we cross over, or step into the other, or whatever, however you want to describe it. And this is something that I've learned through a lifetime of interacting with spirits. I remember one of my earliest experiences with a death was my grandmother, my father's mother, who lived next door to us. And we called her Grandma Shippers. And she suffered terribly with arthritis. And she didn't have a walker, but she would push a straight back chair around her house to support herself, and to keep from falling. Well, one fall day, I remember it was a weekend because we were there. I wasn't at her house, I was home. But my grandma fell, and she was in terrible pain. And my mother ran next door, and my father, and we could hear my grandmother's wails and cries from next door. And I was out on the porch. I was always listening. I paid attention to everything. I did not cover my ears. I listened to those sounds. And then an ambulance came. And the ambulance, it was back in the old days, in the middle of the last century. So it was, looked like a hearse, except it was white. Big station wagon kind of vehicle. And the guys ran out with the gurney. And when they brought Grandma Shippers out, my mom had already come next door by us. We were all outside now, standing in the yard, because there's now an ambulance, and the whole neighborhood, of course, is out watching my grandmother wheeled out of her house. And I'll never forget, she was strapped into the gurney in her hand, and her hand was all crooked from arthritis, and her hand was up on her forehead, and she was wailing. And she said, "No, don't take me to the hospital. I'll never come home. I'll die in the hospital. Everybody dies in the hospital. I'll never come home. Don't take me to the hospital." She's begging as they put her into the back of the ambulance. And my mother said, "Wave to Grandma Shippers and say, tell her you hope she's okay." And so we're like, "Bye, Grandma, you'll be fine. Bye, Grandma," to cheer. As she was wailing, and I couldn't hear the sound of her wails over the siren, but I could imagine it. Well, my father followed in our car to the hospital, and that night he came back late, and I remember seeing him and my mother through the door of their bedroom, and my father was just weeping on my mother's shoulder, and she was consoling him. And what they had found out is when she fell, her hip and her femur shattered because she had bone cancer, and there was no treating it. So she was at the end of her life, of her game. And my father, of course, was extremely distraught. Well, that next week we went to school, and school was it was just shy of a mile away. We would walk no matter what, rain, snow, sleet. It didn't matter. There was no school bus in Chicago at that time. And my mother, there was no way she was going to dress all those tots and babies and drive us to school. So we just had to tough it out. This is where I learned no such thing as bad weather, just bad gear. And we had everything from the baggies in our boots to, our books stuffed into a bread bag so that they wouldn't get wet. But we always walked to school, and we always walked home. And on this day, my other grandma, my mother's mom, Grammy Ethel, and Gramps came to pick us up in his Cadillac. And we thought this was very odd. It wasn't Wednesday, and we used to go to their house on Wednesday for dinner every week, but it was just way too strange. And we got in the car, and And Grammy Ethel was super cheerful, and my big sister Kate was not having it. She was kind of like, something's wrong, I know something's wrong. Well, when we pulled up to our house, my grandmother lived next door to us, and there were lots of cars on the block parked on the street. And we didn't go into our house. We were shepherded into Grandma Shipper's house. And everybody was there, all my aunts and uncles, my cousins on my dad's side, even my aunt and uncle came down from Madison. They were there, and my great uncle there, and everybody was there except for my Uncle Jerry, and my mom and dad were not there. And it was like a party, but it wasn't quite a party. It was because people weren't laughing and telling jokes, but people were drinking. There were bottles of liquor on the counter and in the kitchen, and Grandma's chair sat there empty in the corner of the room. I noticed it, and the arm of the chair, she would sit in the chair and she would rub the arm of the chair with her hand all the time when she'd be watching the news or a movie or whatever. She would just rub her arm, and I looked and I saw this dark, shiny spot that she had rubbed into her chair. And people sat in other chairs, and they pulled out some folding chairs from the basement, but no one sat in her chair. We were all just standing around, and somebody ordered pizza pie, which was a very rare thing. And my Grammy Ethel was helping freshen drinks. She was emptying ashtrays. She was putting out food and being the hostess. And it was just so weird. And so I was standing in the dining room right at the doorway of the kitchen. And it was this galley kitchen. The house was built in the early 40s. So it was just a small galley kitchen, and on one side to my left was a counter with the sink, and then the other side had the fridge and the stove. You couldn't fit more than 3 or 4 people in there, but several of my great uncles were gathered in there around the bottles of liquor. I believe there were cigars being smoked, maybe, or cigarettes. People had cigarettes. And I was standing in the doorway, and my Uncle Gerald, my great Uncle Gerald, I had a ponytail, and he used to stand above me and grab the top of my head and pull my hairs out of the ponytail so they'd be like hanging over my face. He just found this hilarious. And he was doing this, but he wasn't laughing like he usually did when he did this. And I was just standing there watching my other great uncles as they talked softly, unusually, when all of a sudden the cupboard door above the counter kind of did a ee, opened slightly, and a can of chicken a la king came boom and fell onto the counter. And my Uncle Jack, who lived there with my grandma, he said, "Mark the time, she's dead." And I found that such an odd thing for someone to say. And everybody looked at the time, and it was 6:47 or 5:47, I don't remember exactly, but it was a something 47. And they said, "Yep, she's..." My grandmother loved canned chicken a la king. She would make minute rice and pour chicken a la king over it. It was one of her favorite things. And so the chicken a la king can on the counter was a sign to her brothers that she had passed. Well, not 15 minutes later, my mother called, and she told us that Grandma died at 10 to 7 or whatever it was. And I heard Uncle Gerald say on the phone, no, it was 5:47 or 6:47. She told us, she dropped a can out of the cupboard to let us know she was gone. And everybody acted like that was perfectly normal, that there was nothing at all odd about that. And from that moment, that upside down can on the counter, I just felt like she wasn't gone, you know? And the fact that no one sat in her chair, and where people were gathered and talking softly, and some people started to cry and talking about how saintly she was and how she wouldn't have to go to purgatory because she suffered so in this life. And still no one sat in her chair. And I could just feel her there. I couldn't see her, but I could feel her there, and I knew that no one was sitting in that chair because she was, and I'm positive. I don't recall her wake or her funeral. I don't know why. I'm not sure if I went to the wake. I don't think I did, because I have no recollection of it. But I remember my great-grandmother's wake and funeral, and that was Grandma Lyons. That was my Grandma Shipper's mother. And that grandma was the one whose home it was that we lived in. She died about a month or so after my Grandma Shipper's died. And when she did, people were saying they decided not to tell her that Angela, my grandma, had passed away, because she was very close to death herself, and they didn't want her to have to suffer, the pain of hearing that her daughter had died as she herself was dying. And she kept saying, "Why is Angela here? Why is Angela here in the room? Why is she here? I see your father, I see Pa, but I see Angela. Why is Angela with Pa?" Pa had died years before, and she was seeing my grandmother. And they didn't answer. They just, treated her like a batty old woman on her deathbed and ignored it, and nobody told her. And she passed away with her daughter and her husband in the room with her, coming to take her with them, never realizing that Angela had passed a month or so before. I did go to Grandma Lyons' wake. I recall this, and I'm pretty sure this is the first wake I ever went to. I don't know why I wouldn't have gone to my grandmother's. Maybe my father needed to not have us there. I'm not sure. I should talk to my sister, Kate. She would remember if I was there, and I just don't remember it. But I do remember Grandma Lyons. And I remember, and there being this huge crowd. Now, she was like 99 when she died, and she was this amazing little old lady. She was first generation Irish, and she spoke with a Chicago Irish brogue when she spoke. I'll tell you one of her stories maybe later on that she told me. But the place was packed because all of my great uncles worked for the police department. They were all very politically active. And what happens in Chicago is the whole Democratic, every precinct captain comes and pays tribute, honor to someone's mother who passes away, or anyone who passes away. And I remember standing there next to my mother as line and line of people came walking in and shook the hands of all of her brothers, and shook the hand of my father and his brother Jerry, and said the very same thing to every one of them: "Sorry for your troubles. Sorry for your troubles," down the line. And then I remember it was our time to go up and kneel down and say a prayer by the casket, and it was an open casket. And Grandma Lyons was in there. I had not seen her for, I don't think we visited her in her nursing home ever. But she looked exactly the same. She had the white curls around her face, except she looked like I knew she wasn't there. She looked like she was made of wax, like it was a wax doll, I remember thinking. And I was sad. I could feel the sadness in the room. And I sat up with this little ring that I had gotten. It had a little pink stone and just this tiny little ring. And I needed some kind of ritual. I needed something, and I felt like I needed to do something. And so I said to my mom, "Should I give her this ring? I could put my ring in and give her my ring." And my wonderful mother said to me, "You could do that if you want to." And then she said, "But remember, she doesn't need your ring. This isn't her. She's not there. This is just her body." And I thought to myself, yeah, I didn't quite understand it, But as we got up, my mother had told me she's not here, and I kept my little ring. And I stood up with her and turned to go back to where we were sitting and where the other kids were. We were and tear around in the lobby probably. But as I turned to go, I saw her sitting in a straight back chair along the wall. Beyond, there were a bunch of people. Everybody was standing. Nobody was really sitting. There were all these chairs set up for when they did the rosary, but pretty much everyone was standing, and there were people filing through. They'd come through and they'd say, sorry for your troubles, and then they'd head out and go to one of the pubs next door or down the block and hang out there all together. That was part of the ritual. But I saw her sitting there, and she was sitting there just like she used to do when she was at Grandma Shipper's house. And she had her hands folded in her lap, and she had that impish little grin on her face. And she was just sitting there, and as I turned, I caught her like out of the corner of my eye, and I saw her in the dress that she was wearing in the coffin. And I turned fast, and it glanced, and when I looked back, she wasn't there. But I saw her there. And I knew what my mother meant, that she wasn't in that body, because I saw her sitting in the chair over there. And then I thought, why would she be here with us now? And a wake and a service like that is always an outpouring of love, right? And when someone passes, we don't stop loving them. And what I was from her was that she didn't stop loving us either. And her presence there demonstrated that you can still love the people you love, even when your body looks like a wax doll in a box with flowers that smell really funky all around it. Since then, I have never been to a wake or what do they call them? In Michigan, we call them visitations around here. But where I grew up, it was always called a wake. And I have never, ever attended one of those without experiencing the person who had died, their spirit there. Most of the time, I see them. I don't see them like with my eyes, but I see them, and the part of my brain that registers sight is triggered, because it isn't just that I imagine them there, it's that I actually see them. I perceive them there, I suppose is best. I see them with my mind's eye, but it's forged as a memory like that you would see. And every single one I've ever attended has had the people there. Many, many times. Sometimes they know that I'm aware of them. Many times they'll catch my eye and get my attention. Sometimes they have things they want to tell me, things they want me to tell or their loved ones, or to do for them or for their loved ones. It's always to do for them, but it's always for the ones they love. And I'll tell you one. There was a man who died suddenly here in town, and we knew him well, and he had a young adopted children, and they weren't very young. The son was early 20s probably, and he was kind of at loose ends. You know, I remember us joking talking about that he once asked his father, so when do colleges get a hold of you if you're going to go to college? He kind of clueless about how things worked, but he and his dad had been kind of estranged for a while. There was bad feelings. The young man had made choices that his father disapproved of, and had, you know, things about him that weren't what his dad hoped he would do and be, I suppose. You know how that is with your adolescent. It's their, you have dreams for them. You want them to do well, and they start doing things that are like, wait, what are you doing? It's that Lithuanian proverb about our children are like ducklings and we're like hens, and we've hatched out these duckling eggs, and as they go to the water's edge and swim off away from us, we stand there squawking up and down, buck, 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 up and down the shore like, wait, you can't do that. Don't do that. What are you doing? What are you, crazy? So it was sort of like that situation. Anyway, since he passed away suddenly, they never had a chance to reconcile. We all go through this with our children. We all have struggles sometimes. But his life ended before they had reckoned, before he had a chance to let him know that it didn't matter, that he loved him anyway, in so many words, because our children need to hear that, our friends need to hear that, our partners and loved ones need to hear that. So don't wait. But we walked in, and his wake visitation was in the church, and lots of people there, well loved in the community. And I walked in the back doors, and his casket was up at the front of the church. I don't believe it was opened. May have been. I don't recall. But as I walked in, I saw him standing. You know, it was surprising because he looked like a real person. You know, I scanned the room for who was there, you know, see who I was going to walk to first and talk to. And looking up front, there he was, standing there, as solid as the people he was standing around. And he was standing near his wife and some other people. And he was just standing there. And as I walked in, he was looking right at me, like, almost like he was waiting for me. And it was disconcerting at first because he looked so solid, because it didn't feel like an aberration, you know. But I knew, you know. So I made my way around the far end and greeted other people, and then when I went up to hug his family, he was there, and as I walked away from them, I felt him with me. I mean, he was standing right with them the whole time, and then he's right with me. And he told me, and I heard it. I heard it with my ears, and I heard it in my heart, and I knew it in my head. He said, please keep an eye out for, and he named his son. I'm really worried about him and what he'll do. And I just said out loud, I said, don't worry, I will. I'll check up on him. I'll check up on your whole family. I'm saying this as I'm kind of walking between people. And then he says to me, you have to tell him that I love him no matter what. You have to tell him that today, like right now, you have to tell him that I told you that I love him no matter what, and that I always will love him no matter what. And what could I do? You know, he kind of stuck with me, and I went over to his son, and he was still right there with me. And I said to his son, I said, you know, your father loved you very much. And he was like, yeah, right. I said, no, really. He told me this multiple times, flat out. He told me how much he loved you. He told me he loved you no matter what. He told me that multiple times, which was true because he had just told it to me multiple times. So I didn't have to tell him, your father's ghost is here telling me that he loves you. I was able to just tell him that his father had told me multiple times that he loved him. And he looked at me and he said, really? I said, I'm serious. I'm not making this up. I wouldn't say it if it wasn't true. And he got big tears in his eyes, and he just nodded his head. And I just gave him a hug and walked away, and I got in touch with him first month or so, after that, more distanced, and he seemed to be doing okay. And I haven't talked to him in a while, but that love needed to be said. That needed to not go unsaid. And it survived his father's death. And it survives still. I'm sure that he's there keeping an eye even now. You know, my mother died a few years ago, and my father, they both died very close to one another. When I think I'll go back to start with my dad, because he passed first, I suppose. When my father was dying, all 10 of us were able to be there. We all gathered around his bed for days, comforting one another, comforting him, laughing, actually kind of making fun of him a little bit. My mother was also very gravely ill, and she was in the hospital. She was actually in intensive care. He was at home dying, and she was in intensive care. And I remember my brother Tom having his phone, and I had my phone, and we did FaceTime with the two of them from the hospital to his deathbed, kind of like what people have to do with COVID. Talk to each other from afar, say goodbye through a little screen. But then my father was calling for my mother, and my mother was calling for my father. And so we arranged for an ambulance. We talked to the hospital, talked to the doctors, arranged to sign my mother out temporarily, AMA, against medical advice, put her in an ambulance and bring her back home so she could sit at my father's bedside. And I remember their conversation and just watching them and watching her face and them holding hands before he slipped into that coma. You slip into a coma before you die. And she just sat there, and she was exhausted, and she had congestive heart failure. She wasn't able to sit up very long, and he was unconscious now. We said rosaries together, holding hands and sharing. She put the rosary in his hand and then said the rosary with it in his hand. It was so precious. And but then she needed to lie down, and there was nothing left but to just wait. So we rolled in her bed in the room next to his, and all of my siblings and nieces and nephews that were there all stayed around my father, but I said I would stay with my mom, and I went and sat next to her in a chair next to her bed, listening to the sounds next door, familiar sounds. I'd been at deathbeds before, and I just remembered those sounds, and I could feel the energy. I could feel if you're ever lucky enough, if you're lucky enough to be in attendance as someone passes, be there fully, because I could feel the room fill, the house, all the space around just fill with ancestors and angels. The whole house filled with that. And I sat with my mother, and she was lying in her bed, and she said, "Oh, Ti, dying is so hard." And I said, "Yeah, Mom, it is." And she said, my heart hurts so much. Now, my daughter Era lives in Chicago, and she knew that this vigil, this death vigil, was going to be very trying, and I had just experienced a pretty severely traumatic injury, and she was worried about me, and she didn't need to worry about me. I was fine, but she gave me a heart stone, a smooth green heart stone, and I put it in my booby trap, right under here, right next to my heart, underneath there, and just kept it there so I wouldn't lose it and I could feel it. And it was just, I could also feel the energy of her love there with me as well. And when my mother said to me, my heart hurt so much, I thought of the heart stone. And so I reached in and I pulled it out and I put it in her hand, and where I was keeping it, it was warm. It was as warm as my body. And she said, I said, put it on your heart. And I put it on her hand. She said, I can feel how warm it is. I can feel his heart. And I said to her, yeah, you can feel his heart. You're going to be able to feel his heart forever. And we sat there together, and I put my head close to hers, and I just sang a little bit to her as I heard the voices next door call out, there he goes, and then laugh, because there was this great release, and there was this whoosh, and then I heard the tears, and my brothers came in and leaned down to my mom and said, he's gone, Mom, he's gone. And she looked at them, and she looked around the room, and she looked surprised. She said, no, he's not. I said, yeah, he just died. She said, look, he's right there. He's standing right there. And we all looked, and none of us saw him, but I have no doubt whatsoever that he was standing there, that he was in that room with us. Well, the next day, my mother needed to go back to the hospital. Her vital signs, she was crashing again. So, and we had to plan a funeral for my father. And so we went about that task, got my mom to the hospital. We were between the hospital and the funeral home, and the funeral home and the hospital, and getting everything together. It was a whirlwind, and I thank my lucky stars. There are times when, I thank my lucky stars at that time that there were 10 of us, because we divided up all the jobs that needed to be done, and we all did it. My father was a pretty well-known figure. He was an historical figure, and so we had not just an obituary, but we needed to write a press release, and we got calls from New York Times and places. They ran stuff on him. I won't go into who he is. You can look him up, but there was a lot of that going on while my mother was in her active dying in the hospital. And the day of his wake, everything finally got put together. There was a venue for the funeral. There was a venue for the church for the funeral, a venue for the reception, whatever you call it, the funeral party, the wake, the funeral home, everything was done. And it was the day of the wake. And my mother I don't know why they do this. Why do they medicate people who are clearly in their end stage? But her organs were shutting down. Her extremities were blue and cold. She had no pulse in her extremities. She was slipping away. The doctors told us that it was between hours and a short day that she was going to survive on the day of my father's wake. And that morning, they decided to give her steroids for some unknown reason, protocol for what she was, the pneumonia she was experiencing. But she reacted badly to the steroids, and it caused her to hallucinate and to flip out into this unrecognizable state. It appeared as though she was exercising her life. You know, she was, and several of us, not all of us, but some of us were there to witness this and there that day, and it was emotionally and physically draining. And I just kept trying to, you know, that push that energy, push that love into her, but she was inconsolable. And when they sedated her, it took quite a while for that to happen, and we were all a wreck. And then we're like, we can't leave her. She's dying, and it's Dad's wake, but we can't leave her alone. And the staff, it was going to be ours. And so Era got on the phone and figured out, talked to a social worker at the hospital, and we hired someone to sit there with her with our cell phone number. The hospital was 15 minutes, 20 minutes from where the wake was. And keep just, if anything changed, they would call us immediately and we could all be there. So I left the hospital and went to the wake, and everybody else, you know, when your loved one dies, you get to go to the funeral home an hour or more before it's open to the public. And it gives you time to, you know, do a little private grieving and experience the reality that this person is passed and be together and all this stuff. Well, since I was at the hospital, I was the last one to leave the hospital, so I got to the wake when it was packed with people. And everybody, you know, I wanted to see me as I walked in. I don't think they realized that I hadn't been there earlier, because everybody wanted to talk to me. And I just wanted to go up and spend a minute with my father's coffin. And I couldn't focus. I was so exhausted and drained. And I felt like every ounce of energy had been sucked out of me in that day with my mother. And I finally made my way up to the casket, and somebody came up to try to talk to me, and I was crying. Just release, you know, you got to release that grief, and tears are a wonderful way to do that. The adrenaline comes out, the grief. And this older woman comes up and says, she, you know, pats me, she says, "Oh, honey, how did you know him?" And I was like, I didn't say the whole thing out loud, but I thought it, and I said, "This is my father." And she said, and then I think she had a little dementia because she just went, she had only seen him a couple weeks before and blah, 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 and talking to me. And I finally turned and I said, "Is anybody with this lady? Please come get her away from me so I can have a minute." And I'm glad I asserted myself, because as soon as she was gone and I was standing there and I opened my eyes, and there at the head of his casket was my father. His body was in the casket, clearly, but he was standing there. And he was so enjoying his wake. The guy, he used to talk about his wake and his funeral when he was alive. From the time he was in his 40s, things like, "This will be my last Christmas. I wonder who's coming to my wake," you know. He was there, and he was really enjoying that whole scene. And I said to him, you know, everybody thought I was just praying, but I said, "Dad, here's the deal. I know it's really important for you to be here, and you need to do that. You should be here, because this is your wake, and everyone is here to honor you." That was a long reconnect. I said, "Everyone's here to honor you, but Mom is dying. Mom's in the hospital, and she's dying, and she needs you. She needs you to be there for her. And I said to him, what you may not have realized yet is that you don't have to just be in one place. You can be in both places. You can be here and you can be there at the same time, which is true. Think about it. If you don't have your body, space is not a constraint. You could be at both places. You could be every place. And he looked at me, and he looked a little ticked off, actually, to be honest with you. Like, wait a minute, this is my party. And he just went and disappeared. And I have not seen him since. I've seen every other spirit that's passed in my family, but not my dad. My mother did not die that night, even though I told my cousins, keep your calendar open for the rest of the week because we'll be having round 2 before Friday probably. But the next morning when we went to the hospital, before one of my brothers went to spend the rest of the night there. And the rest of us went off to get something to eat and drink, sometimes a little too much. But that morning, when I went to the hospital to see my mother, she was at her bed, propped up, and she was eating a bowl of oatmeal. And her kidney function had returned. We called my mother Lazarus through many of these near-death experiences of hers. And she ended up going home from the hospital, being in hospice, but she did get to be home. And then about a month later, it was time for her to go. I say that she grabbed a hold of my father's shirt tails as he left and followed him out. My sisters and I, we all talked. My mother would rally when we would all come. And I don't know what it was, but she would be like, where the doctors would say she has hours, all her organs are shutting down, and we'd all go in the room with her, and she would bounce back. And there's something that I read that is just fascinating, that every child that you carry in your body, even those that don't come to term, or those that are stillborn, or any child a woman carries in her body, leaves behind them fetal cells. Fetal, F-E-T-A-L, cells. And those fetal cells remain in the woman's body forever. And I heard on some podcast or science show or something about how a scientist was studying these fetal cells and following them in women well into their 80s. And what he found is that they found women that developed cancer and had a tumor, and they found an abundance of these fetal cells that were clustering around the tumor. And at first he suspected that they were somehow had caused the tumor, until he realized that what these cells were doing was blocking the tumor from spreading. Fetal cells. Now, we are connected. So like my fetal cells were still in my mother's, along with my other 9 siblings. And we are connected energetically with all parts of us, right? And we're connected energetically to our parents. My mother could sense when I was feeling lost or down, and she would call me. And even now, I know that she knows when I need her because she's there. We're connected energetically. And I have a theory that when we all gathered around her as she was dying, all our fetal cells would be like, there they are, dude, get to work. And they'd go in and repair and fire her up again. And so we said, she was suffering. She was missing my father. She was so sad. We decided that we were not going to all rush to her bedside. If half of us were there, the other half of us would stay put, and at the same time, we all lit a candle, and we called her out. We invited her to come and leave her body behind. And on the day that she died, I had just been in touch with my sisters who were far away from my mom, and we said, okay, let's light our candles. And we lit our candles, and it may just be a coincidence, but doesn't matter. Within just a few minutes, we got the call that she had passed. So when my father died, we had this big church service, and it was beautiful and very traditional and just wonderful, perfect for him. For my mother, my sister Mimi, who lives in New Orleans and is friends with someone who helps exiled artists from Katrina, exiled musicians, they keeping a connection between New Orleans musicians. Now, my mother's family is originally from New Orleans, and my mother felt such a kinship to New Orleans. On her 80th birthday, Mimi and Mark put together this, we called it Granny Gras, and all her kids for her 80th birthday sneaked into New Orleans without her knowing, and we had a second line to celebrate her 80th birthday. So for her funeral, we decided to have a second line, and we hired a brass band. And the funeral was only a block away from the church, but it was across a busy street. They wouldn't close the street on the north suburbs of Chicago like they would have done in New Orleans for us. But we got to the end of the big parking lot, and we all processed behind the brass band, pushing my mother's coffin along into the church, and they played. And then after the service, they put the coffin out, on the thing and covered it, and as it's going to leave the church, they played just real slowly in minor key, just few chords of When the Saints Go Marching In, and then they turned toward the door and all of a sudden just kicked it up to this rousing rendition of When the Saints Go Marching In. And in New Orleans, it's called Cutting the Body Loose. You mourn and then you cut them loose. And my mother was right there. And my mother was the happiest I have seen her in years. I could feel her. I could feel her all around, and I could glimpse her out of the corner of my eye with various people on different parts of the aisle, listening to the things that people said about her, listening to the prayers and the music. And when that band started playing that, I could feel her just go, phew. And her big heart just encompassed everything and all of us. And tears fell, but not tears of sadness. It was tears of joy. I just felt her big heart, her big love, the kind of love that you learn raising 10 children through hard times. Loving every stray, every friend, every person who they brought with them. Loving every grandchild and great-grandchild. That big love just went boom and exploded in the room. And everybody smiled. Yeah. And then we sang when they were putting her her body in the hearse to drive it up to Wisconsin to lay her next to my father. The band played Will the Circle Be Unbroken, and we all sang. And my mother loved that. She loved that so much. So love lasts. I can still feel her love. I bet you can feel the love of people who've passed. It can make you sad sometimes, There are times that I'm like, I wish I could just call her and just listen to her voice. In the end, she had dementia, and We often joked about you had the phone call lasted 20 minutes, but it was really a 3.5 minute conversation on loop. But that's okay. And what I would give to be able to have that looping conversation where you'd tell her something and a little later in the conversation she'd say, "Oh, you know what I heard, did you know?" And it was what you yourself had told him. But I feel her now. I feel her all the time. I feel my brother Tom all the time. I know that I've not stopped loving them. It's a new kind of love. It's a different kind of love. And I know, because I feel it, that they have not stopped loving me. It's a new kind of love. It's a different kind of love, but it's love nonetheless. And that should be celebrated. On Valentine's Day, cheers, and every day. Be kind to one another. Sometimes you're here and then a minute later you're not. Sometimes you spend a lifetime mad at somebody, waiting for them to apologize, waiting for them to admit they made a mistake. When none of it matters. None of it matters. I know a lot of us have experienced, even our own family members, distance between us because of politics and because of vitriol and things thrown out by people we have that care nothing about our relationships. I'm not saying that, I hear people saying, yeah, it's not that I disagree with their politics, I disagree with their morality. Well, the people that I love, many of them have been not many, but several of them have been on the other side of things I've believed firmly in. But that's not our relationship. That's not the relationship we have with each other. And I'm not going to let that get in the way of that love that we've had. That's not what I love about them. Isn't there something you don't love about even the people you love the most? I mean, seriously? But I'm not going to forgive people for bad behavior. I'm not talking about being a doormat or saying that I accept, if you're racist or you're hateful or whatever, stand on something. But I'm not going to keep that. I'm not going to let that darken my own heart. If I could give 30 seconds of unconditional love to perfect strangers who were skinheads, then I can love unconditionally the people I grew up with, the people I've known my whole life. It's just what I choose to do, because what we all need is more love. And the best way to do that is starting with ourselves, right? Well, I wasn't sure if I had enough to fill an hour tonight, but you know me, I can go on and on and on. But it has been an hour. And so, I wish you all well. Be kind to yourself, be kind to others. Love the best you can. And when you can't love the best you can, love just a little bit. Have a wonderful night. I'll see you next week. Cheers.